Welcome to Terror Time. Today we're diving into a world of horror and mystery. We'll explore a terrifying story that will send chills down your spine and uncover mysterious events that took place in abandoned places. If you're a fan of horror and thrill, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any updates. Your support helps us continue and bring you better content. Get ready to face the buried fears, and let's begin this thrilling journey on Terror Time. I've always considered myself a city person. The hustle and bustle of urban life, the convenience of having everything at your fingertips, and the constant flow of people. That's what I was used to. But life has a way of throwing curveballs, and mine came in the form of a job transfer to a small town on the outskirts of a vast forest. At first, I was hesitant. The idea of living so close to nature, away from the comfort of city lights and 24-hour convenience stores, was unsettling. But as a single father to my 10-year-old daughter Lily, I knew this could be an opportunity for a fresh start and a chance to spend more quality time with her. We moved into a quaint house with a spacious backyard that bordered the forest. The real estate agent had sold it to us as a feature, talking about the beauty of nature and the peace it would bring. Little did I know that this proximity to the woods would lead to the most terrifying experience of my life. Lily, being the adventurous spirit she is, took to our new surroundings like a fish to water. She was fascinated by the trees, the birds, and the idea of exploring the great outdoors. It wasn't long before she started pestering me about going camping. "Dad, please, can we go camping? Pretty please?" she'd ask, her eyes wide with excitement. I'd always laugh it off, saying, "Maybe next weekend, sweetie." But the truth was, I simply didn't see the appeal. The idea of sleeping on the hard ground, battling mosquitoes, and being away from modern comforts didn't exactly scream fun to me. But Lily was persistent. Every day she'd come up with a new reason why we should go camping. She'd show me pictures from her school books of happy families gathered around campfires, telling stories and roasting marshmallows. She'd talk about her classmates' camping adventures, her voice tinged with longing. As the weeks passed, I found myself running out of excuses. I realized that while camping might not be my idea of a good time, it clearly meant the world to Lily. And isn't that what being a parent is all about? Stepping out of your comfort zone for the sake of your child's happiness? So one Friday evening, after a particularly long week at work, I made a decision that would change our lives forever. "Hey Lily," I called out as I entered our home, "how would you like to go camping this weekend?" The look of pure joy on her face made any hesitation I had melt away. She squealed with delight, jumping up and down, her pigtails bouncing with each hop. "Really, Dad, you mean it? We're really going camping?" I nodded, a smile spreading across my face despite my reservations. "Yes, sweetie, but let's start small, okay? How about we camp in our backyard this time?" Lily's excitement didn't diminish one bit at the suggestion. If anything, she seemed even more thrilled at the idea of transforming our own backyard into a campsite. "That's even better, Dad. We can practice for when we go to a real campsite. Oh, this is going to be so much fun." Her enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself getting caught up in her excitement. We spent the rest of the evening planning our camping trip, making lists of what we'd need, and discussing what activities we could do. As Lily chatted away about ghost stories and stargazing, I couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation building. Maybe this camping thing wouldn't be so bad after all. Maybe, just maybe, I'd been missing out on something special all these years. Little did I know that our innocent backyard camping adventure would turn into a night of unimaginable terror, one that would haunt me for years to come. The next morning we woke up early, both of us buzzing with excitement. Lily could hardly contain herself as we ate breakfast, her words tumbling out between bites of cereal. "Dad, can we set up the tent now? Oh, and can we make a campfire and roast marshmallows and tell scary stories?" I chuckled, her enthusiasm warming my heart. "Slow down, sweetheart. We have all day to set everything up. Let's start with the tent, okay?" After breakfast, we headed to the garage where I'd stored the camping gear I'd bought years ago, thinking I might one day use it. The tent was still in its original packaging, never opened. As I pulled it out, a cloud of dust rose, making us both cough and laugh. Looks like this tent has been waiting for us for a long time, I said, brushing off the dust. Lily giggled. It's okay, Dad. We're going to give it a great first adventure. We spent the next few hours setting up our campsite in the backyard. Our yard wasn't huge, but it was big enough for our purposes. The grass was a little overgrown, adding to the wilderness feel, as Lily put it. At the far end, a wooden fence separated our property from the dense forest beyond. Setting up the tent proved to be more of a challenge than I'd anticipated. The instructions were vague at best, and more than once I found myself tangled in tent poles and canvas. Lily found this hilarious, of course, and her laughter echoed through the yard as she watched me struggle. Dad, you look like a pretzel. She giggled as I tried to untangle myself from a particularly stubborn tent pole. I couldn't help but laugh along with her. Well, how about you come help your pretzel dad then? Together we managed to get the tent up. It wasn't perfect. One side sagged a bit, and I wasn't entirely sure we'd used all the pegs correctly. But it was standing, and that was good enough for us. It's perfect, Dad, Lily declared, beaming with pride at our accomplishment. Next came the sleeping bags. We unrolled them inside the tent, creating our cozy sleeping area. Lily insisted on arranging and rearranging the inside of the tent, making sure everything was just right. As the afternoon wore on, we tackled our next challenge, the campfire. Our backyard had a small fire pit that the previous owners had installed, which was perfect for our needs. Lily helped me gather small twigs and branches from around the yard for kindling, while I brought out some firewood I'd bought from the local hardware store. Now remember, Lily, I said as we arranged the wood in the pit, fire can be very dangerous. You must never try to start a fire on your own, okay? She nodded solemnly. I promise, Dad, I'll always wait for you. I smiled, proud of her maturity. That's my girl. Now, want to see how to start a fire? Her eyes lit up. Yes, please. I showed her how to arrange the kindling and larger pieces of wood, explaining each step as I went. Then, with a flick of a match, our campfire came to life. The flames danced merrily, casting a warm glow as the sun began to set. Lily clapped her hands in delight. We did it, Dad. We made a real campfire. As dusk settled in, our backyard was transformed. The flickering firelight cast long shadows, and the chirping of crickets filled the air. It felt like we were miles away from civilization, not just steps from our back door. We roasted hot dogs over the fire for dinner, followed by the obligatory marshmallows for dessert. Lily's face was a sticky mess of melted marshmallow and chocolate, but her smile was brighter than I'd seen in a long time. As we sat by the fire, bellies full and hearts content, Lily snuggled up next to me. This is the best day ever, Dad, she said softly. Thank you for doing this with me. I wrapped my arm around her, feeling a lump form in my throat. You're welcome, sweetie. I'm glad we did this too. As the night deepened, we told stories by the firelight. Lily regaled me with tales from school and her own imaginative stories about magical forests and talking animals. I shared some of my childhood memories, carefully edited to be kid-friendly, of course. Eventually, Lily's eyelids began to droop, and I knew it was time to call it a night. All right, camper, I said, ruffling her hair. Time to hit the sack. We doused the fire, making sure it was completely out before heading to our tent. As we zipped ourselves into our sleeping bags, I couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. We'd done it. We'd gone camping, even if it was just in our backyard. Good night, Dad, Lily mumbled, already half asleep. Love you. Love you too, sweetheart, I whispered back. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the curtains, I realized the night had gone quiet. No more scratching. No more of that terrible screeching growl. Had it gone? Lily had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep, but I couldn't bring myself to close my eyes. I gently laid her down on the bed and, steeling my nerves, went to the window. Slowly, carefully, I pulled back the curtain just enough to peer out. The backyard was bathed in the soft light of early morning. Everything looked normal. The tent was still there, though it had collapsed at some point during the night. There was no sign of the creature. I let out a shaky breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Had it all been a terrible nightmare? But no, the fear had been too real, too visceral. And Lily had seen it too. I spent the next hour checking every room in the house, looking for any sign of intrusion. Everything was as we'd left it. Finally, I allowed myself to relax just a little. When Lily woke up, her first words were, "Dad, was that real? Did that really happen?" I sat down next to her on the bed, pulling her close. "Yes, sweetie, it was real. But we're safe now. It's gone." She looked up at me, her eyes wide. "What was it, Dad?" I shook my head. "I don't know, Lily. I've never seen anything like it before." We spent the rest of the day inside, both of us too shaken to venture out. I called in sick to work, and Lily stayed home from school. We tried to distract ourselves with movies and games, but the events of the night hung over us like a dark cloud. That evening, as I was making dinner, I heard Lily call out from the living room, "Dad, come quick." I rushed in, fearing the worst, but Lily was just pointing at the TV. The local news was on, and the headline made my blood run cold. "Strange creature sighted in local woods." The reporter was talking about multiple sightings of an unidentified creature in the forest bordering our town. The descriptions matched what we had seen: unnaturally tall, pale skin, long limbs. Some people had managed to capture blurry photos or shaky video footage. As we watched, a wildlife expert came on, trying to explain away the sightings as a bear or some other large animal. But I knew better. We knew better. Over the next few weeks, the sightings continued. More and more people came forward with stories similar to ours. The town was in a state of fear and excitement. News vans from bigger cities started showing up, and there was talk of calling in state or even federal authorities to investigate. Lily and I never went camping in the backyard again. In fact, we rarely ventured into the backyard at all, especially after dark. But sometimes, late at night, I would hear that familiar scratching sound outside, or catch a glimpse of something tall and pale moving at the edge of the woods. We thought about moving, but where would we go? If this creature, or others like it, were out there, was anywhere truly safe? Months passed, and gradually life in our town started to return to normal. The sightings became less frequent. The news crews packed up and left, and people began to dismiss the whole thing as mass hysteria or an elaborate hoax. But Lily and I knew the truth. We had seen it with our own eyes, heard it with our own ears, and we knew that somewhere out there, in the darkness of the forest, it was still waiting. One evening, about a year after our encounter, Lily came to me with a serious look on her face. "Dad," she said, "I think we need to go camping again." I was shocked. "Lily, after what happened, are you sure?" She nodded firmly. "I'm sure, Dad. We can't let fear control us forever. Plus, I've been doing research. I think I know what that thing was, and I think I know how to protect ourselves from it." I listened as she explained her theories, a mix of folklore, cryptozoology, and good old-fashioned survival skills. I had to admit she'd put a lot of thought into this. "All right," I said finally, "we'll do it. But we're going to prepare, and we're going to be careful." Over the next few months we planned, we researched, we trained. We learned about tracking, about wilderness survival, about the legends and myths of creatures that lurk in the shadows. And finally, on a crisp autumn evening, we packed up our gear and headed into the woods. Not our backyard this time, but the real thing. As we hiked deeper into the forest, I felt a mixture of fear and excitement. I knew the creature might be out there, watching, waiting, but this time, we were ready. As we set up our campsite, I realized something had changed. The forest no longer seemed like a place of terror, but a place of mystery and adventure. Yes, there were dangers out there, things beyond our understanding, but there was also beauty and wonder and the thrill of discovery. That night, as Lily and I sat by our campfire telling stories and roasting marshmallows, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. We had faced our fears, confronted the unknown, and come out stronger for it. And if that creature or anything else decided to pay us a visit, well, this time we'd be ready. As I looked across the fire at Lily, her face glowing in the firelight, I saw not just my little girl, but a brave, curious, resilient young woman. Whatever challenges life might throw at us, whatever strange and terrifying things might be lurking in the shadows, I knew we could face them together. And so, dear listener, that's my story. A tale of terror, yes, but also a tale of growth, of facing fears, and of the unbreakable bond between a father and daughter. Remember, the next time you're in the woods and you hear a strange sound or see a shadow move in a way it shouldn't, It might not be your imagination, but don't let that stop you from exploring, from seeking adventure. Just be prepared, be brave, and always keep your loved ones close. For in the end, it's not the monsters in the dark that define us, but how we face them, and who we face them with. When I tried to ask the chief about it later, he shut me down hard. "Some things are above your pay grade, Ranger," he said, his face stern. "Just focus on your job and leave the rest to those who need to know." But how could I just focus on my job when the very reality around us seemed to be unraveling? The fog kept spreading, and with it came more sightings, more inexplicable events. Campers would go missing, only to turn up days later with no memory of where they'd been. Wildlife behaved erratically. We had reports of nocturnal animals active in broad daylight, and of species that shouldn't even be in our region. And then there was the road. I'd noticed it on maps before, but never given it much thought. A highway that seemed to cut through part of the park, but didn't connect to any outside roads. When I asked about it, I was told in no uncertain terms that it was off limits, not just to the public, but to us rangers as well. Only military vehicles used that road, and we were never to approach it or even talk about it. All of these oddities were starting to add up to a picture I wasn't sure I wanted to see. It was as if the park, our park, the place I'd sworn to protect, was hiding something. Something big, something unnatural. I started doing my own research, digging through old reports, talking to longtime employees. Most were reluctant to say much, but I started to piece together a pattern. Our park had a history of strange occurrences going back decades, unexplained disappearances, bizarre animal behavior, and always the fog. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself going through some of Professor Blackwood's old notes that he'd left me. Most of it was standard stuff, observations about wildlife, notes on forest management. But tucked in the back of one notebook, I found something else. A series of symbols I didn't recognize and a hastily scribbled note. "The veil is thinning. They're coming through." I stared at those words for a long time, a chill running down my spine. What had the old professor known? What had he been trying to tell me all those years ago? I was so lost in thought that I almost missed it. A sound outside my cabin. A sort of scratching, like something with claws dragging across the wooden walls. I froze, listening intently. There it was again, followed by a low guttural sound that was almost but not quite a growl. Slowly, quietly, I reached for my rifle. Whatever was out there, it wasn't a normal animal. I could feel it in my bones. As I approached the window, the fog outside seemed to press against the glass, thicker than I'd ever seen it. And in that fog, I saw something move. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. A shape that seemed to shift and change as it moved, defying all laws of biology and physics. One moment it looked almost human, the next it was something utterly alien. My heart pounding, I raised my rifle, though I wasn't sure what good it would do against whatever this was. The creature paused, and I swear it turned to look directly at me. I couldn't see eyes, but I felt its gaze, cold and ancient, boring into me. For a moment we stayed like that, locked in a silent standoff. Then, without warning, it let out a screech that shook the windows and made my ears ring. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard before. Part animal, part machine, and part something else entirely. I stumbled back, my rifle clattering to the floor. By the time I regained my composure and looked back, the creature was gone, melted back into the fog like it had never been there at all. My hands shaking, I reached for my radio. "This is Ranger Davis," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've just had an encounter at my cabin. I need backup." There was a long pause before the reply came. "Stand by, Davis. A team is on its way." Within minutes, I heard the rumble of vehicles approaching. But these weren't our standard Ranger trucks. These were heavy, military-grade vehicles, the kind I'd only ever seen on that mysterious road we weren't supposed to talk about. Men in hazmat suits poured out, armed with weapons that looked far more advanced than anything I'd ever seen. They swept the area around my cabin, taking readings with strange devices and speaking in coded language I couldn't understand. One of them approached me. "Ranger Davis, we need you to come with us." "What's going on?" I demanded. "What was that thing?" The man's face was hidden behind his mask, but I could hear the gravity in his voice. "That's classified, Ranger, but you're about to get some answers." They escorted me to one of their vehicles. As we drove through the park, I was struck by how different everything looked. The fog seemed to part for these vehicles, revealing glimpses of a forest that no longer looked familiar. Strange lights flickered between the trees, and more than once I caught sight of shapes moving in the shadows that defied description. We arrived at a facility I never knew existed, hidden deep in the heart of the park. As the heavy steel doors closed behind us, I realized I was about to learn the truth about what we'd really been guarding all these years. The debriefing lasted for hours. They told me things that shook my understanding of reality to its core. Our park, it turned out, wasn't just a nature preserve. It was a containment zone, a place where the fabric of our world grew thin, allowing things from elsewhere to slip through. The fog wasn't just weather. It was a manifestation of this weakening barrier, a visual representation of the blending of realities. And our job as rangers wasn't just to protect the wilderness, but to act as the first line of defense against incursions from beyond. They showed me footage of creatures that defied description, entities that seemed to shift and change as you looked at them. They told me about the experiments they'd been conducting, trying to understand and control these phenomena. "Why are you telling me all this now?" I asked, my head spinning from the revelations. The man who seemed to be in charge, he never gave his name, looked at me gravely. "Because the incursions are increasing. The barrier is weakening faster than we can reinforce it. We need every able body we can get, and you've proven yourself capable of handling the truth." He slid a folder across the table to me. "This is your new assignment. From now on, you're part of our special containment unit. Your job is to help us keep these things in check, to protect not just the park, but our entire reality." I opened the folder with trembling hands, scanning the documents inside. New protocols, advanced weapons training, and most intriguingly, instructions on how to recognize and potentially communicate with entities from beyond. As I read, I couldn't help but think of Professor Blackwood. Had he known about all this? Is this what he had been trying to prepare me for all along? "One more thing," the man said, interrupting my thoughts. "Once you accept this assignment, there's no going back. You'll be privy to information that would shatter most people's understanding of the world. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about everything I'd seen, about the years I'd spent in this park, always feeling like there was something more going on beneath the surface. I thought about the promise I'd made to protect this land and all who visited it. "I'm in," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. The man nodded. "Good. Training starts tomorrow. Get some rest, Ranger. You're going to need it." As I was escorted to my new quarters, I couldn't help but feel a mix of fear and excitement. The world as I knew it had changed forever, but I was now part of something bigger than I could have ever imagined. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would take me to the very edges of reality and beyond. The next few months were a whirlwind of intense training and mind-bending experiences. I learned to use technology that seemed centuries ahead of anything I'd known before. We practiced containment procedures for entities that defied the laws of physics. I even began to understand some of the strange symbols I'd seen in Professor Blackwood's notes. A language of sorts, used to communicate with some of the more benign interdimensional visitors. But nothing could have prepared me for my first real mission as part of the containment unit. It started with a routine patrol. The fog was thicker than usual that day, swirling and pulsing in a way that we now recognized as a sign of increased interdimensional activity. My partner, a seasoned agent named Sarah, and I were checking the perimeter of a known weak spot in the barrier. That's when we heard it, a sound like reality itself was tearing. A rift opened up right in front of us, a swirling vortex of colors that hurt to look at directly. And through that rift came something. It was massive, easily the size of a house, with countless writhing tentacles and eyes that seemed to look in all directions at once. As it emerged, the very air around it seemed to warp and twist. Sarah and I sprang into action, deploying our containment gear. Beams of energy shot from our devices, creating a field around the entity. It roared, if you could call that mind-shattering sound a roar, and lashed out with its tentacles. For what felt like hours, we struggled to contain it, to push it back through the rift. Other teams arrived, bringing more advanced equipment. The entire time I could feel the creature's alien consciousness pressing against my mind, trying to break through. Finally, with one last surge of energy from our combined equipment, we managed to force it back through the rift. As soon as it was through, our tech team sealed the breach, closing off that weak point in reality. As we stood there, panting and exhausted, I realized that this was what I'd been training for. This was the true purpose of our park, of our entire organization, to stand as the thin line between our world and the chaos that lay beyond. Over the next few years, I participated in countless operations like this. Some were successful, others less so. We lost good people along the way, taken by entities we couldn't contain or lost in dimensions we couldn't reach. But we also made incredible discoveries. We learned to communicate with some of the more peaceful interdimensional beings, gaining knowledge that advanced our understanding of the universe by leaps and bounds. We found ways to stabilize some of the weaker points in the barrier, reducing the number of incursions. And through it all, I often thought back to Professor Blackwood. I wondered how much he had known, how much of this he had experienced himself. In a way, I felt like I was carrying on his legacy, protecting the park and the world in ways I never could have imagined when I first started as a simple forest ranger. Today, as I write this account, I'm sitting in my office overlooking the park. The fog is out there, as always, hiding secrets that most of the world will never know. Tourists come and go, marveling at the natural beauty, unaware of the other realities that brush against ours in this place. Sometimes I envy them, their simple enjoyment of the forest. But then I remember the wonders I've seen, the incredible truths I've learned about the nature of our universe, and I know that I wouldn't trade this knowledge, this purpose, for anything. So the next time you visit a national park, take a moment to really look at your surroundings. That unusual fog, that strange sound in the distance, that feeling of being watched. It might not be just your imagination. Remember, there are those of us out here standing guard at the edges of reality, protecting you from things you never knew you needed protection from. And if you ever feel a calling to the deep woods, a pull to serve and protect in ways you can't quite explain, well, we're always looking for new recruits. The forests hold more secrets than you could ever imagine, and we need all the help we can get to keep those secrets safe. As for me, I'll be here, watching the fog, ready for whatever might come through from the other side. Because that's my job now, ranger, guardian, protector of realities, and I wouldn't have it any other way. I have never been one for camping. The appeal of sleeping on the hard ground, battling mosquitoes, and foregoing modern comforts has always eluded me. Give me a comfortable bed, air conditioning, and indoor plumbing any day. But life has a funny way of pushing us out of our comfort zones, especially when it comes to the people we love most. My daughter Emily is the complete opposite of me when it comes to the great outdoors. At 10 years old, she's a bundle of energy and curiosity, always eager to explore and experience new things. Her fascination with nature and adventure is something I both admire and, if I'm being honest, find a little perplexing. It all started when Emily came home from school one day, her eyes shining with excitement. "Dad, Dad," she exclaimed, practically bouncing as she entered our apartment. "Guess what we learned about in school today?" I smiled, always happy to see her so enthusiastic about her education. "What's got you so excited, sweetie?" "We learned about camping and survival skills," she said, dumping her backpack on the floor and pulling out a colorful pamphlet. "Look, our teacher gave us this. It shows all the cool things you can do when you go camping." I took the pamphlet, flipping through pages filled with images of happy families gathered around campfires, hiking through lush forests, and gazing at star-filled skies. It all looked very idyllic, but I couldn't help thinking about the less glamorous aspects. The bugs, the lack of comfortable sleeping arrangements, the potential dangers lurking in the wild. "That's great, honey," I said, trying to match her enthusiasm. "It looks like you learned a lot today." But Emily wasn't satisfied with my lukewarm response. She fixed me with those big, pleading eyes that she knows I have trouble resisting. "Dad, can we go camping? Please? It looks so fun." And there it was, the request I'd been dreading since I first saw that pamphlet. I hesitated, searching for a gentle way to let her down. "Well, sweetie, camping takes a lot of preparation and equipment, and you know I'm not really the outdoorsy type." Her face fell, disappointment clear in her eyes. "But Dad, all my friends have gone camping with their families. Sarah even went last weekend, and she said it was the best time ever. I felt a pang of guilt. It was true that I wasn't the most adventurous parent, and I knew Emily sometimes missed out on experiences because of my preferences. I thought about my own childhood, how my parents had always encouraged me to try new things, even if they weren't comfortable with them themselves. Looking at Emily's hopeful face, I made a decision. Maybe it was time for me to step out of my comfort zone, for her sake. "You know what? Let's give it a try," I said, barely believing the words coming out of my mouth. Emily's eyes widened in disbelief. Then she let out a squeal of joy and threw her arms around me. "Really? You mean it? We're going camping?" I hugged her back, already wondering if I was going to regret this decision. "Yes, really, but let's start small, okay? How about we camp in our backyard first? That way, if anything goes wrong, we're close to home." Emily nodded eagerly, too excited by the prospect of camping to be disappointed that we weren't heading into the wilderness right away. "That's a great idea, Dad. It'll be like a practice run. Can we do it this weekend?" I nodded, mentally rearranging my weekend plans. "Sure, we can do it this weekend, but we'll need to get some supplies first. How about we make a list of what we need?" For the next hour, Emily and I sat at the kitchen table, poring over her camping pamphlet and making a list of essential items. Tent, sleeping bags, flashlights, first aid kit. The list grew longer and longer. I tried not to wince at the thought of how much this little experiment might cost. As we worked, I couldn't help but notice how engaged and focused Emily was. She was taking this very seriously, thinking through every detail and coming up with ideas I never would have considered. It was a side of her I didn't often get to see, and I found myself becoming more enthusiastic about the idea despite my reservations. That night, after Emily had gone to bed, I sat in the living room looking out at our modest backyard. It wasn't much, just a small patch of grass with a few trees along the fence line. But to Emily it was about to become a campground, a place of adventure and new experiences. I thought about my own childhood, the times I'd spent indoors while my more adventurous friends were out exploring. I'd always told myself I was content with my books and video games, but looking back I wondered if I'd missed out on something important. Maybe this camping trip wasn't just for Emily. Maybe it was a chance for me to experience something new, to bond with my daughter in a way we never had before. And who knows, maybe I'd even enjoy it. As I went to bed that night, I found myself, much to my surprise, looking forward to our backyard camping adventure. Little did I know that this simple father-daughter bonding experience was about to turn into something far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. The weekend arrived faster than I expected. Emily was bursting with excitement as we set up our tent in the backyard. I have to admit, her enthusiasm was infectious. As we worked together to pitch the tent and organize our supplies, I found myself enjoying the experience more than I thought I would. "Dad, look, I think I see a shooting star," Emily exclaimed as we sat outside our tent that evening. The night was clear and the stars seemed brighter than usual. I smiled, relishing this moment of connection with my daughter. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" As the night deepened, we roasted marshmallows over a small fire pit and told stories. Emily was in her element, regaling me with tales she'd learned in school about constellations and forest creatures. Eventually her words began to slow, and I could see her eyelids drooping. "Time for bed, kiddo," I said, ruffling her hair. We crawled into our sleeping bags, and I listened as Emily's breathing slowed into the rhythm of sleep. Despite the hard ground beneath me, I felt a sense of peace. Maybe this camping thing wasn't so bad after all. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a sound. At first, I couldn't place it. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, a cross between a screech and a low, guttural growl. My heart began to race as I strained my ears, trying to determine where the sound was coming from. It seemed to be coming from the woods beyond our fence, but it was hard to tell for sure. I glanced over at Emily, relieved to see she was still fast asleep, oblivious to the unsettling noise. I didn't want to wake her and cause unnecessary fear if it turned out to be nothing. Slowly, carefully, I unzipped my sleeping bag and crawled to the tent entrance. The sound came again, louder this time. It sent chills down my spine. Whatever was making that noise, it wasn't any animal I was familiar with. I unzipped the tent flap just enough to peer out. The backyard was bathed in silvery moonlight, casting eerie shadows across the grass. Everything seemed still, peaceful even. But then I saw it. At the far end of the yard, near the fence bordering the forest, something moved. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. It looked like a shadow, darker than the surrounding night, shifting and undulating in a way that defied natural movement. I blinked hard, sure that when I opened my eyes again, the strange shape would be gone. But it wasn't. If anything, it seemed more defined now. As I watched, frozen in a mixture of fear and disbelief, the shape began to move. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too long and jointed in all the wrong places. It moved with a fluid grace that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was this some kind of elaborate prank? A hallucination brought on by too many campfire stories? But deep down, I knew this was real, and it was unlike anything I'd ever encountered before. The creature, for lack of a better word, seemed to be pacing along the fence line. Its movements were purposeful, almost as if it was patrolling. Every so often it would stop and turn its head towards our tent. I couldn't make out any features in the darkness, but I had the unsettling feeling that it was aware of our presence. I wanted to retreat back into the tent, to wake Emily and make a run for the house. But I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even call out. All I could do was watch in horrified fascination as this impossible being moved through our backyard. Suddenly the creature stopped. It turned fully towards our tent, and I felt my blood run cold. Even though I couldn't see its eyes, I knew with absolute certainty that it was looking directly at me. For what felt like an eternity, we stayed like that, me, peering out from the relative safety of the tent, and this otherworldly being, standing motionless in the moonlight. The night seemed to hold its breath, the usual sounds of crickets and distant traffic completely silenced. Then, without warning, the creature moved. It took a step towards our tent, its movement so fluid it seemed to glide across the grass. That was all it took to break me out of my paralysis. I scrambled backward, zipping the tent flap closed as quietly as I could with shaking hands. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it would wake Emily, but she slept on, blissfully unaware of the terror just outside. I crawled back to my sleeping bag, my mind racing. What should I do? Should I wake Emily and make a run for it? But what if sudden movement attracted the creature's attention? Should I call for help? But who would believe me if I described what I'd seen? As I lay there, every muscle tense, straining my ears for any sound of approach, a new noise cut through the silence. It was a scratching sound like claws or long nails dragging across the fabric of the tent. I held my breath, my eyes wide in the darkness. The scratching continued, moving slowly around the perimeter of the tent. It was as if the creature was testing, searching for a way in. I reached out and grasped Emily's hand, ready to shake her awake at a moment's notice. But still, I hesitated. As long as the creature remained outside, maybe it was better to let her sleep through this nightmare. The scratching stopped at the tent entrance. I could hear something breathing heavily just on the other side of the thin fabric barrier. It was a wet, raspy sound that sent shivers down my spine. Then slowly the zipper of the tent began to move. The zipper inched upward, each tooth separating with an agonizing slowness that seemed to stretch time itself. My breath caught in my throat and I found myself frozen, torn between the instinct to flee and the desperate hope that if I remained perfectly still, the creature might somehow overlook us. But as the opening widened, revealing a sliver of the night beyond, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. With a sudden surge of paternal protectiveness, I shook Emily awake. "Emily," I whispered urgently, my hand over her mouth to muffle any sound she might make. Her eyes flew open, wide with confusion and fear as she registered the panic on my face. I put a finger to my lips, then pointed at the slowly opening tent flap. Her gaze followed my gesture, and I felt her body stiffen as she realized something was very wrong. In that moment, as I looked into my daughter's frightened eyes, I knew I had to be brave. For her, I had to get us out of this nightmare. With my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, I leaned close to Emily's ear and whispered as quietly as I could. "When I say run, we sprint for the house. Don't look back, just run, okay?" She nodded, her face pale in the dim light that filtered through the tent fabric. The zipper was almost fully open now. I tensed, ready to spring into action. Just as I saw a long, pale hand begin to push through the opening, I shouted, "Run!" We burst out of the tent, catching the creature by surprise. In the split second I allowed myself to look, I saw it recoil, momentarily stunned by our sudden appearance. Emily was ahead of me, her small legs pumping furiously as she sprinted towards the back door of our house. I was right behind her, my eyes locked on her back, willing her to go faster. I could hear the creature recovering, its unnatural movements rustling through the grass behind us. The sound spurred me on, lending speed to my legs that I didn't know I possessed. We reached the back door, and I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the lock. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature was crossing the yard with impossible speed, its long limbs eating up the distance between us. In the full moonlight, I could see it clearly for the first time, and the sight nearly stopped my heart. It was vaguely humanoid, but that's where any resemblance to humanity ended. Its skin was a sickly pale color, stretched tight over an emaciated frame. Its arms and legs were too long, jointed in ways that defied anatomy. But it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. Where there should have been eyes, there were only dark, empty sockets. Its mouth was a gaping maw filled with needle-sharp teeth. As it ran, it let out that terrible screeching growl I'd heard earlier. Just as the creature reached out with its long, clawed hands, I managed to get the door open. We tumbled inside and I slammed the door shut, locking it immediately. Emily was crying now, the fear and confusion finally overwhelming her. I scooped her up in my arms, holding her close as I ran through the house, closing and locking every door and window. We ended up in my bedroom, huddled together on the bed. I could hear the creature outside, circling the house, occasionally scratching at the walls or windows. Emily buried her face in my chest, her small body shaking with sobs. "It's okay, sweetheart," I murmured, stroking her hair. "We're safe now. It can't get in." But even as I said the words, I wasn't sure I believed them. What was this thing? How could something like this exist? And most importantly, what did it want? We stayed like that for hours, jumping at every sound, every shadow. I kept expecting the creature to burst through a window or somehow find its way inside. But as the night wore on, the sounds outside began to fade. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the curtains, I realized the night had gone quiet. No more scratching, no more of that terrible screeching growl. Had it gone? Emily had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep, but I couldn't bring myself to close my eyes. I gently laid her down on the bed and, steeling my nerves, went to the window. Slowly, carefully, I pulled back the curtain just enough to peer out. The backyard was bathed in the soft light of early morning. Everything looked normal. The tent was still there, though it had collapsed at some point during the night. There was no sign of the creature. I let out a shaky breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Had it all been a terrible nightmare? But no, the fear had been too real, too visceral, and Emily had seen it too. As I stood there trying to make sense of what had happened, I realized something had changed. Not just in our backyard, but in me. The world suddenly seemed much larger, much stranger, and much more dangerous than I had ever imagined. But as I looked back at Emily, sleeping peacefully on the bed, I also realized something else. I would face 1,000 such creatures to keep her safe. Our camping trip may have turned into a nightmare, but it had awakened something in me, a fierce protectiveness and a determination to be the father Emily needed, no matter what terrors the world might hold. I knew that life would never be quite the same after this night, but as I settled back onto the bed, pulling Emily close, I also knew that whatever came next, we would face it together. My father told me a story once. I'll never forget it for a few reasons. I think it's the first story he's ever told me as a child. It's also the story of how my grandfather had died. But honestly, that isn't the reason. You hear stories on TV or sometimes you overhear something in public. People talk about ghosts or aliens and you think to yourself, that isn't real. They're making it up or they're mistaken. They're crazy. Something like that. You can't just believe it. That is, until something happens to you. Something that brings it all together, connects the dots in a way that you didn't think of before. Maybe it happened to you, or maybe you hear about the same story again and again from different people. It doesn't take long for the world to become a lot bigger than you thought it was. I remember the night my father told me this story. I was about 12 years old, and we were sitting on the porch of our old farmhouse in Ohio. The sun had just set, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. There was a chill in the air, and Dad had wrapped an old quilt around my shoulders. He seemed different that night, more serious than usual. His eyes had a faraway look, as if he was seeing something beyond the fields that stretched out before us. "Son," he said, his voice low and gravelly, "there's something I need to tell you. Something about your grandfather and about the night he died." I sat up straighter, suddenly alert. Grandpa had died before I was born, and Dad rarely spoke about him. This was new territory, and I could sense the importance of the moment. Dad took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for what he was about to say. "What I'm going to tell you, it's going to sound crazy, but I need you to listen, and I need you to understand that every word of it is true." And then he began his tale, a tale that would change the way I saw the world forever. "Your grandfather and I, we used to go hunting together, not for sport, mind you, but because we needed the money. Times were tough back then, and we'd hunt coyotes for their pelts. $50 a skin, it helped put food on the table." He paused, lost in memory for a moment. "Sometimes, if we were lucky, we'd come across a deer. Our landlord didn't mind us taking one now and then, and it would feed the family for days." I nodded, trying to imagine my father as a young man out in the woods with his own father. It was an image that both excited and unsettled me. "This particular night," Dad continued, "we were out later than usual. We'd had no luck with the coyotes, and we were hoping to at least bring home some venison. We were cutting through the woods on our way back home when we came upon something." His voice had dropped to almost a whisper, and I found myself leaning in closer to hear. "At first we thought it was the work of coyotes, or maybe a pack of feral dogs. There was blood everywhere, splattered on the trees, soaking into the grass, turning the creek water red. But as we got closer, we realized this was something else entirely." Dad's eyes had taken on a haunted look, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "You see, son, when predators like wolves or coyotes hunt, they do it clean. They'll single out the weak or the sick, run it down, and make a quick kill. What we saw that night, it wasn't a hunt, it was a massacre." He described the scene in vivid detail, the torn bodies of the deer, parts strewn about as if whatever had attacked them had done so out of pure savagery rather than hunger. As he spoke, I could almost see it, could almost smell the coppery scent of blood in the air. "Your grandfather, he was a brave man, foolishly brave maybe. He decided we needed to track whatever had done this, to put it down before it could hurt anyone else. I wanted to go home, to call for help, but he insisted, said it was our duty." Dad's voice cracked a little, and he paused to collect himself. I sat in silence, both terrified and captivated by the story. We followed the trail of blood deeper into the woods. The further we went, the more wrong everything felt. The woods were too quiet, like every living thing was holding its breath, and then we started hearing noises. He trailed off, his eyes unfocused, as if he was back there in those woods, reliving that terrible night. "What kind of noises, Dad?" I whispered, almost afraid to ask. He turned to look at me, and the fear I saw in his eyes made my blood run cold. "Noises no animal should make, son. Screams that sounded almost human but not quite, and underneath it all this low rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once." As he continued his story, describing their terrifying trek through the darkening woods, following the trail of a creature they couldn't identify, I found myself glancing nervously at the shadows beyond our porch. The familiar landscape of our farm suddenly seemed alien and threatening. Little did I know that this story, as horrifying as it was just the beginning. That night would set in motion a chain of events that would lead me to my own encounter with something beyond explanation, something that would make me question everything I thought I knew about the world. But for now, I sat and listened, as my father's words painted a picture of a night that ended in tragedy and terror, a night that would haunt him for the rest of his life. My father's voice grew more strained as he continued. We kept following the trail, even as every instinct told us to turn back. The sounds were getting louder, more frenzied. It was like the whole forest had gone mad. He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. That's when we came upon the old schoolhouse. You know the one, son. That abandoned building on top of the hill, half torn apart by that tornado years ago. I nodded, familiar with the local landmark that had been the subject of many ghost stories among us kids. As we got closer, the noises changed. There was this screeching sound, like nothing I'd ever heard before. It was high-pitched, but also had this low growl underneath, both at the same time. It didn't seem possible for any creature to make that sound. Dad's hands were shaking now, and I could see beads of sweat on his forehead despite the cool night air. Your grandfather, he was determined to see this through. We crept up to about 20 yards from the schoolhouse when we heard another sound. It was, God, I don't even know how to describe it. Like paper being torn, but mixed with the sound of water sloshing in a bucket. He looked at me, his eyes haunted. Your grandfather whispered to me then. He said we were about to corner our prey, that any animal will fight when it's cornered. He thought it was probably a single rabid dog. But deep down, I think we both knew it was something much worse. Dad's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The plan was to sneak up while it was eating, shoot it, and keep shooting until it stopped moving. If it got to your grandfather, it was my job to shoot or stab it until it got off him. I felt a chill run down my spine at the grim determination in my father's voice. We approached slowly, me right behind your grandfather, and then we saw it. Dad's eyes seemed to lose focus, as if he was seeing that terrible sight all over again. It was leaning over a carcass, tearing off flesh and just throwing it. There was blood everywhere, glistening in the moonlight. The creature, it looked almost like a man, but not quite human. It had arms and legs like ours, but it was sitting like a monkey, all hunched over. And its hands, they weren't normal. Long fingers with claws at the end. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the story coming to life in my mind with vivid, terrifying detail. Your grandfather hesitated. He wasn't about to fire at what looked like a person, so he cleared his throat, trying to get its attention. Dad's voice cracked. Son, I swear, in that moment, all sound just stopped. I've never heard true silence before that, and never again afterwards. For 2 seconds, nothing made any noise. Nothing. He took a shuddering breath, and then the thing turned around. It let out this ungodly cry and pounced on your grandfather. He got a shot off, but I think he missed. If he hit it, it didn't even faze the creature. Tears were forming in Dad's eyes now. It was on him in an instant, tearing entire parts of him off. I started shooting it point blank with my .22, but the thing barely bled. I got off 5 rounds and then started hitting it with the butt of the gun, but it didn't even budge, didn't even seem to notice I was there. I felt sick to my stomach, but I couldn't look away, couldn't stop listening. It tore out his throat, ripped his nose clean off and gouged out his eyes. Then it scalped him and started digging in. I don't exactly remember what happened next, but somehow your grandfather's knife ended up in the thing's shoulder, and what was left of your grandfather ended up on my back. Dad's voice was barely audible now. I ran faster than I've ever run before or since. I could hear it following me, branches cracking, that terrible screeching sound. But I never looked back. Not once. He fell silent for a long moment, lost in the horrific memory. When he spoke again, his voice was hollow. I tripped and fell in some gravel. When I looked up, I saw our landlord and some of his friends around a campfire. I screamed for help, told them to call an ambulance. But then the landlord looked at me and said something I'll never forget. Dad's eyes met mine, filled with a mixture of grief and lingering terror. He asked me, "What is that on your back?" And then he realized it was your grandfather's shirt with bits of him still in it. That's when we heard that screeching again. The landlord grabbed me, threw me inside. We locked all the doors, got the guns out. He shook his head slowly. The creature circled the house all night. We could hear it, see glimpses of it through the windows. It only left when the sun came up. Dad fell silent, the story apparently over. I sat there, stunned, trying to process what I'd just heard. Part of me wanted to believe it was just a story, a terrible nightmare my father had conjured up. But the raw pain and fear in his eyes told me otherwise. "Dad," I said hesitantly, what do you think that thing was?" He looked at me for a long moment before answering. "Your grandfather's people, the Cherokee, they had stories about creatures they called skinwalkers, humans who could take on animal forms or something in between. I don't know if that's what we encountered that night, but I do know it was something that shouldn't exist in this world." As we sat there in silence, the night seeming darker and more ominous than before, I realized that my understanding of the world had fundamentally shifted. There were things out there, terrible things, that defied explanation, and somehow I knew that this knowledge, this story, would shape the course of my life in ways I couldn't yet imagine. I currently live in a very old town. It's the kind of place that seems frozen in time, where the buildings on Main Street look like they haven't changed in a century, and everyone knows everyone else's business. Our town is nestled in the middle of nowhere, with a population of just a few thousand people. It's the sort of place most folks would drive right through without a second glance. But during the summer months, our sleepy little town experiences a surprising influx of visitors. You might think it's because of some quaint local attraction or a famous historical site. The truth is far more mundane, and in a way, that makes it even more bizarre. You see, the crown jewel of our town, the thing that draws in tourists and travelers alike, is our gas stations. Yes, you heard that right, gas stations. They're conveniently located just off the highway, making our town the perfect pit stop for long-distance travelers. I know it sounds ridiculous. Sometimes I catch myself thinking, is this really the best thing our town has to offer? A couple of well-placed gas stations? But that's the reality of life in a small town like ours. We take our blessings where we can find them, I suppose. I live on the outskirts of town, down a dirt road that seems to stretch into oblivion. It's the kind of road where you can drive for miles without seeing another soul. The only other person who lives out this way is an old woman everyone calls Grandma Dixie. Dixie's been a fixture in these parts for as long as anyone can remember. Her husband passed away a few years back, leaving her alone in that big old house of hers. It's a place that's seen better days, with peeling paint and a porch that creaks ominously under your feet. But Dixie refuses to leave, says the house holds too many memories, too much history to just abandon it. Being the closest neighbor, I've taken it upon myself to check in on Dixie at least twice a day. It's not much, just a quick visit to make sure she's okay, that she has everything she needs. Sometimes I'll bring her groceries or help with small repairs around the house. That house of hers, though, it's becoming a real concern. The structure is so old, I sometimes worry it might collapse around her one of these days. I've tried to convince her to come live with me, or at least to consider moving into town where people can keep a closer eye on her. But Dixie's stubborn as a mule. She just smiles that wrinkled smile of hers and says, "This old house and I, we're going to see each other through to the end." One of the biggest headaches with Dixie's place is the back door. The latch is broken, has been for years, so the door never stays properly shut. I've rigged up a system with a cinder block to keep it closed, but Dixie has a habit of using the block as a step stool and forgetting to put it back. It drives me crazy thinking about how exposed she is out here, all alone with a door that won't even close properly. But it's not just the house that worries me. It's where we live, this stretch of road surrounded by dense, dark woods. During the day, it's beautiful in a wild, untamed sort of way. But at night, it becomes a different world entirely. The darkness out here is absolute. On a moonless night, you can't see your hand in front of your face. The trees seem to swallow up all light, creating a blackness so complete it feels almost solid. And then there are the sounds. I've lived in rural areas all my life. I'm used to the normal nighttime noises, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But out here, especially on certain nights, there are sounds that defy explanation, sounds that make the hair on the back of your neck stand up and your heart race in your chest. Sometimes, deep in the woods, you can hear what sounds like crying or weeping. It's faint at first, easy to dismiss as the wind or your imagination playing tricks. But then it grows louder, more distinct. It's a sound filled with such sorrow, such despair, that it makes your very soul ache to hear it. Other nights, the sounds are more terrifying. Screams that seem to come from just outside your window, inhuman shrieks that echo through the trees. They're the kind of sounds that freeze you in place, that make you afraid to even breathe lest whatever is making them notices you. I've asked Dixie about these sounds, if she's ever heard them. Her reaction is always the same. She gets this faraway look in her eyes, shakes her head and says, "It's never good to talk about such things, dear." And then she changes the subject, quick as you please. Her reluctance to discuss it only fuels my curiosity, of course. But there's something in the way she says it, a hint of fear behind her usual cheerful demeanor, that always stops me from pressing the issue. Living out here, hearing these things night after night, it's enough to make a person question their sanity. But I know what I've heard, and deep down, I think I've always known that there's something not quite right about these woods. Little did I know that my suspicions were about to be confirmed in the most terrifying way possible, that the truth about these woods, and the things that dwell within them, was far more horrifying than anything I could have imagined. I remember one evening I went over to Grandma Dixie's house. It was getting late and we were watching Jeopardy, together, as we often did. Dixie loves her wine, and by the time Double Jeopardy came around, she was pretty tipsy. I decided this might be the perfect opportunity to ask her about the screaming in the woods. To my surprise, instead of brushing off my question as she usually did, Dixie actually opened up. Her eyes took on a faraway look, and she began to speak in a low, almost reverent tone. "These woods," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "they're cursed, you know, cursed by creatures older than time itself." I leaned in, hardly daring to breathe, afraid that if I moved or spoke, she might stop talking. "The town," she continued, "it wasn't always ours. We took it by force from the natives who lived here before. They warned us, told us about the things that lived in these woods, but we didn't listen. We were too greedy, too sure of our own power." As Dixie spoke, painting a picture of the town's dark history, things started to make sense. The town's small size, the fact that no one ever seemed to want to stay for long, it all fit into place like pieces of a grim puzzle. "These creatures," I ventured to ask, "what are they?" Dixie's eyes snapped to mine, suddenly sharp despite the wine. "They're mimics," she said. "They can sound like anything, anyone. That's how they lure people into the woods. And once they get you—" She trailed off, shaking her head. A chill ran down my spine as I thought of all the strange sounds I'd heard over the years. Had they all been these creatures trying to lure me into the darkness? As Dixie continued to talk, sharing bits and pieces of local lore and her own experiences, I found myself growing increasingly uneasy. It was getting late, and I still had to walk back to my own house. I double-checked Dixie's house before I left, making